Hola, it's Joe Pardavila, and welcome back to the Forbes Books Podcast. And if you're listening to this, you probably like listening to podcasts. And luckily for us working on podcasts, business is booming. An estimated 68 million Americans listen to podcasts every week in 2020. And with more listeners and advertisers than ever, podcasting is here to stay. Joining me today is a gentleman who is leading the way in the podcast universe. His name is Will Malnati, and he is the founder and CEO of At Will Media, one of the fastest growing independently owned podcast studios in the U.S. Hey, Will, how are you?
I'm great, Joe. Thanks for having me.
So I want to talk to you because you've created some sort of podcast empire. But before we get into it, what was your gateway drug for podcasting? How did you get into it?
Hold on. Before we get into that, I first need to just acknowledge the fact that you have an incredible radio/podcast voice. And I'm sure you get that a lot, but it's hilarious hearing it through my earphones right now.
Because
thank you very much. I actually feel like I'm live, like, first time caller, long time listener type of deal.
I'm going to send you a t-shirt and a bumper sticker in the mail, Will. All right. How's that sound?
Please do.
How's that? That sounds old school enough, right? Yeah.
No, I love it.
Thank you.
Anyways, where were we?
Yeah, your gateway to podcasting.
I actually heard my first podcast in 2015, and it was this podcast by Brian Koppelman called The Moment. Mm-hmm. Essentially, it was like this weird moment for me in my life, actually, which was I was in the hospitality industry. I had been there for, 10 plus years, working my way up and then eventually opening my own restaurants. And I was kind of having this internal dilemma, which was, am I going to continue the rest of my life in the hospitality industry, or am I going to maybe pivot at some point into a different career path? And for me, listening to that, it was something that someone had sent me. And back then you're kind of opening up this purple app that you don't really know what it is. And so I opened it and I was like, wow, this is so interesting. It's on-demand radio. I haven't really seen that. And this guy is talking about, the moment that you made it sometimes a pivot in your career. And so all these things were kind of staring at me in the face. And I was like, wow, maybe this is my moment to kind of decide that I'm going to make a career move. And also, what is this medium that I'm listening to at the same time, and what else is happening kind of in this podcast space. And so I started to really dig into it, understand what was happening, but more importantly, what wasn't happening in the space at that time. And I started to feel like, wow, there's a ton of potential here that is probably untapped, and I feel like maybe this is all very kind of serendipitous, and maybe I need to look into this like seriously. And so from that moment, I kind of started to slowly pull away from the hospitality industry, and it took years to kind of do that fully. But on the side, I was pursuing and learning about the podcast space, a space where for me at that moment, since I had spent my 20s in hospitality, it was important that I could kind of like become a producer on day one, because I hadn't worked in the mailroom. I hadn't worked as an assistant, to an agent or, any of that stuff. And so, but I had the skill set. I knew I had the skill set that I had learned from the hospitality industry that, to be honest, has a lot of commonalities in production. People don't typically think that there would be any type of crossover between restaurants and film or TV or podcast production, but I'm actually kind of the one who's out there saying, I can point you to, 20,000 different things that all kind of correlate.
Yeah, it is funny that people don't realize that podcasting, like many other mediums, it's incredibly important, the networking factor of it, and the point that you were coming from hospitality, where it's all about networking, and it's finding supplies and finding people. You need that sort of baseline. Whether you have the talent or the executional skills to do it is another thing, but you sort of need that ability to work with people and gather a team together. So I'm sure a lot of those skills are very transferable for you.
Exactly. So you know what I'm talking about. Those are the exact things that I knew that I was good at. And I, then started meeting producers of different TV shows and of different films, and started speaking with them about like what are they really good at. And a lot of the things that they were saying they're good at, rang true, I felt like, for me as well. And it started with just that, is being personable, and being able to deal with a lot of different types of people, and, like you said, network.
Yeah, it's funny because I did radio my entire life, and one of the things I noticed when I started working in film, I made a short film last year, and one of the things I pulled from my radio days is always surround yourself with the best possible people who know what they're doing. Because as long as you have that sort of core group of people that are going to say, hey, no, this is how it's actually done, and you're like, okay, cool, now I get it. And I'm sure that was important for you to make that jump, to be surrounded by folks who knew what the hell they were doing and didn't know the hospitality game. They knew what they were doing in the podcast or entertainment space.
You're dead on. And that is really what I set out to do. Like back in 2015, I kind of reached out to so many different folks in and around the entertainment space that I knew I could say, hey, do you know anyone that is in audio or that is even in radio? Because I want to meet them and I want to pick their brain about kind of like how they've made their way into that, what they're doing, what works, what doesn't. And that was a big part of 2015 and 2016 for me, which was just learning from people who were already in it. And without that, I don't think I ever would have actually pursued it in the way that I did.
I love sort of the sliding doors thing about, what if it's that friend of yours never sent you that podcast? Do you
Right.
think you'd ever even, like, I'm sure eventually podcasts would have, come on your radar, but at that moment, it was almost like this kismet thing where it's like, okay, I'm probably, even maybe deep down subconsciously, you were probably thinking about doing other things, and then you get this podcast sent to you, and you're like, wait a minute, what's a podcast? And wait, this person's actually speaking to me directly, and something that is deep inside my soul. Have you ever thought about that? About like, holy crap, I probably wouldn't be here if it wasn't for that just one moment.
All the time. I think about that a lot, and I tell people about that a lot. And I'm a huge believer in just the idea that all things are meant to be. And if you're pursuing anything and putting your hand out there to meet people or learn about something, things will come your way. And that's just kind of how life works. At least that's how it's worked for me. Thank God.
And you did mention earlier about when you first were doing the deep dive into podcasts, you noticed that there were things missing. What was it in your ears that you were like, we got to do something here with this? What was missing to you in the podcast game at the time?
I think me, like many people at that time, Serial had kind of just come out, and they really raised the bar on what production could be in the space. I think, at that moment, there was lots of comedians doing chat shows, and that's really the main point of podcasting, I guess, at that moment. And so when I looked and saw Serial and just saw that they were essentially making a documentary, an investigative documentary for your ears, it was something that was kind of a light bulb to myself, and I'm sure lots of other people who ended up pursuing podcasts, which was like, oh, wow, way more can be done in this space. It's going to involve more people than just a host and a guest. It's going to involve potentially sound designers and very skilled editors and field recordings, as well as studio recordings, so there was just a lot of different elements that were being used in something like that I think had to date really only been used in I guess This American Life, was using that kind of like elevated level of production, but mostly it was only seen in visual documentaries, or this is also long before anything fiction really was happening, and so you were only seeing those in TV and movies, and so I felt like they were only scratching the surface. And if I could like kind of hurry up and learn what I needed to in the space, I maybe could be on the forefront of hopefully what is to come.
So it's your essential entrepreneurial moment where you're like, I find a problem, I fix the problem. So you set out to do this. You gather a troop of talented folks in the game. What are your next steps to? Were you at Will Media at the time, or were you still sort of like, I don't even know what to name this thing kind of thing?
At that moment, we were. By the way, I say we. It wasn't anyone. It was me in a hundred square feet of office space that I rented at a Regus in Times Square. It was like the most unsexy situation ever, but I needed to have a space that I could focus on this thing. And I really was like trying to figure out what I could on my own. And I think I was calling it At Will Radio at the time, because I didn't even know enough about podcasts that saying At Will Radio is kind of like stating that you're a different medium than you are.
It's passe. Yeah, I mean, it's funny. You even see the major radio companies drop the word radio. I mean, iHeart was the first. They were iHeartRadio. They switched to iHeartMedia. Entercom, which had purchased CBS radio stations, they were using radio.com, and now they changed it to Audacity. So, yeah, you are seeing this movement of like, yeah, let's not call it radio. All right, so then you finally figure out that, okay, I'm cool. I'm going to call it At Will Media. What were some of the projects initially? Because you mentioned that you thought the documentary lane was pretty good, a fiction. What were some of your initial shows that you dove into?
Yeah, it's interesting because my first thought in the space was, okay, how do I create like a library of content? How do I get like a bunch of shows going that we're producing? And I was kind of spraying bullets at that point. But what I did was I asked a few friends who, a couple of them were actors who kind of had fan bases, or someone that was actively listening to them. And then a couple of people, like, there was a food blogger who I liked, and another, a couple of other just like personalities. And I said to them, hey, I'll produce your podcast for free. You don't have to pay me anything. And really what it was for me was like my education. Like, I didn't know if I was going to be able to make them any money. I didn't know how the space really worked yet, but I convinced them to kind of do this thing with me, and kind of it allowed me to really kind of learn, and it allowed them to activate their brands, their personal brands. And so it was kind of a win-win for everyone at the time. And as I, tried to, these were like nights that I was up all night editing these, shows, because it was just me. And then finally we got some kind of ad inventory, and then I could hire like half of a person to help me. And, it was just, that was the struggle. And really what I ended up finding out in that first year when I was trying to balance, 5 or 6 different shows like this is a very difficult business model if you don't have real distribution. And so I was just putting out shows and busting my ass to kind of put these things out. But if you don't have marketing dollars or promo dollars to go against the shows, then really you're doing a lot of work for maybe not a lot of reward. And so, we were able to make some money because the shows did pretty good, but not at the, they weren't doing as well as they needed to support a real business model. And so once I really figured that out, that was kind of my first like pivot within my pivot, if that makes sense. Yeah. I had pivoted industries, and now I needed to kind of pivot what I thought, the business model should be. And so from there, I started focusing on things that I could do in a work for hire capacity. And so I started basically going to friends at different brands, different companies, and saying, hey, I have a podcast production company. First, I had to tell them what a podcast was mostly. And I had to explain that to them. But once I did, I was able to get in the door of some primarily publishers at the time who wanted to kind of make the leap into audio and needed help navigating, through the space. And so I made myself as a, available entity for, different services related to podcasts. And it just kind of hyper grew our business, which was, I was able to then hire people because I had revenue coming in off these, production services projects. And those were my first, moves. And that was with Entertainment Weekly and with, GQ and, different Hearst brands like Town and Country. Those were my first paying customers. And, they were the first time I was able to say, okay, this could be a real business. If I pursue it like this could actually lead to something more, and I don't have to raise money, which at that point was important to me.
And talk to me about getting into this branded space, because at the time you were doing it, that was very new. I mean, no one was really doing that. I mean, folks were either producing on their own, or one of these large media companies were using the talent on hand to do it, or an NPR or New York Times kind of thing. But why did you think the branded content lane would be sort of lucrative for you at the time?
I think I didn't even actually know when I didn't know that it would be. I wanted to just I was seeing some brands kind of dip their toe in the audio space in different capacities. I was kind of like, if this brand is doing it, I wonder if their competitor would. And so, that's kind of how I made my way. But the first job that I got was through my friend Jenna Weiss Berman, who is co-founder of Pineapple Street Studio. And basically, she said, we're working on this project for Entertainment Weekly, and this is how much they pay, and this is what you need to do. And so that was kind of like new to me. I was like, wow, so people are paying you to do things like that? Like, I'm over here doing all those things already, but not having any guaranteed income. This feels to me like a decent path. And by the way, if Entertainment Weekly wants to do it, then maybe, like I said, maybe GQ wants to do it. If GQ wants to do it, well, then maybe The Atlantic wants to do it. And so I kind of just followed the path that way as I saw more and more. Again, back in the day, it was just publishers that were really trying to get into it. I just followed that road. And thank God I did, because that part of our business allowed us to grow to like 15 people or so, just based on the production services side.
That's awesome. And, it's funny because people always ask, can anybody do a podcast? And I say, sure, anybody can do a podcast. Not anybody could do a podcast well. So that's now more than ever very important for people, because the technology doesn't you don't need a studio anymore. I mean, folks, especially in New York City, are running podcasts out of their closets in their third floor walk-ups. So you can do it anywhere, but it's having the right people. So talk to me about your team, because from what I understand, you went from you working in that little space in Times Square to having upwards of 20-something employees. So talk to me about that team.
Yeah, I mean, I thank God every day for that team. Yeah, like you said, we're 25, full-time people right now, and the team is really dynamic. I mean, it's people not only that have been in podcasts before, but we brought people in from different types of media. We brought people in from video, we brought people in from editorial, we brought people in from tech, we brought people in from late night, shows, and now film and TV. And so I think we really have tried to put together a super diverse group of people that all kind of come from different walks of life. And I think that just brings different perspective for every project that we do. Where a lot of companies are like, well, if you didn't work at NPR, then, you can't work here. Right. For me, it's like, well, I want people from NPR, but I also want people who worked at the New York Times in editorial. I also want people who worked at Jimmy Fallon, that's kind of interesting to me. And then you can see fireworks with those types of groups when you put them together to put their heads together on something.
And let's talk a couple of your projects before I let you go. Super excited about the Siegfried and Roy original project you're doing with Apple. Can you give me some info on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's something that we've been developing for about a year and a half now, and that we're in production on. It's the first podcast that Apple TV Plus has announced as a standalone audio podcast that isn't associated with another TV show or other form of show that they have as part of the platform. And it's a project that I kind of brought in a partner on. His name is Stephen Leckhart, and he is he's an Emmy award-winning journalist. He's unbelievable. The guy is a super creative. He has directed and produced a bunch of different documentaries over the past few years that have tons of accolades, and he has been an extremely great partner in this process. But that comes out soon, and we are actually presenting it at Tribeca Film Festival as part of their first podcast presentation at the festival.
That's awesome. And so, as you know, the podcast space is a lot more crowded than it was when you started it. I think I saw something that Apple has like 2 million podcasts currently active. So someone as a leader in the space, how do you worry, or do you even think about cutting through that clutter? What do you think is, maybe someone listening now who's either start as a startup in any kind of medium, what differentiates you from anyone else?
One thing that we really try to do is we try to find projects that are one of a kind, or projects that maybe haven't been done before, whether it's by their format or because of its structure, or because of its subject matter. We are not trying to kind of copy other companies. We're not trying to do kind of things that you can be seen done a lot in the space. We're actually trying to carve out a lane that says, hey, like, we're doing things differently. And you can see that in a bunch of our projects, especially some that haven't been announced yet, but even one that was announced pretty recently called Breakthrough, which is an Audible original, the first audio-only singing competition in the podcast space. And for us, it was important to say, hey, what can we identify that works in other mediums? What can we identify that hasn't been done yet in audio? And how can we execute on that at a high level in a way that makes it make sense for it to be audio only? You can't do everything that maybe had been done in TV or in film, but there are certain things that I feel like are perhaps maybe even a better experience for the ears. That's how we're looking at projects, is what hasn't been done yet. How do we carve a lane out of things that are super unique and super premium? And so that's kind of, you'll hear some of the announcements that are coming out of things we're working on, over the next year. And I think that will click even more so than it does right now.
That's cool. And, there's a business book, I'm not sure if you ever read it, it's called The Go-Giver. And one of their kind of laws is your true worth is determined by how much you give in value, then you take in payment. And it seems like that's something that's really driven your career in terms of you going above and beyond and offering people more value than you're actually taking back in payment. Is that a correct sort of analysis of Will Malnati here?
I'd love to think that that's a correct assessment. I think that we do both. I think that we've done a great job at building a company on cash flow, and without outside capital. I also think that, yes, for me, creating value and creating audio that really exceeds the expectations of both our partners and our platform partners is what it's all about for us. It's something that we consistently challenge ourselves to have better quality and more outside of the box thinking. And that is what really, I would take that over extra dollars any day, because right now we're in building mode. We are still hustling every day to not only make this company better and better, but to also just kind of put our stamp on the audio space in a way that we haven't done thus far. Because I think for a lot of the time we've flown under the radar. And I think that this year is just a huge year for At Will Media. And anyone who didn't know our name will certainly know it after this year.
And you're one of the fastest growing independently owned podcast studios. And Will, I don't need to tell you, every day you're reading about one of these behemoths purchasing one of these studios, whether it's a Spotify or a Stitcher or one of those iHeart. They're all gobbling up these smaller companies. Not that I expect you to tell me your future plans for At Will Media, but is that something that's on the possible radar for you, where you're like, eventually for me to scale up, I'm going to have to sell to a large conglomerate?
I think that all things are on the table. I'm what's important to me is not having a huge payday. What's important to me is being a great company that appreciates its team and that continues to put out great content. That's the reality. I'm not just saying that. For me, it's important that I build something in the entertainment space that is significant and that makes a lot of people on our team feel proud to be on it. And if one day someone comes along that allows us to kind of elevate in a way that we couldn't do ourselves, or adds this kind of strategic partnership that propels us into lanes that we want to be in and can do that faster, then of course, I think you can always kind of have that conversation, but it's not why I'm in it. And it's not something that I wake up pursuing. Right now, we're just in a great place having fun. That's the bottom line. We have fun, and we're creating things that hopefully lots of people will enjoy. And again, this is Forbes, right? So you always got to think about the dollar.
Yeah.
Luckily, we're doing all right there, and hopefully we'll continue to do so.
Awesome. His name is Will Malnati. He is the CEO at Will Media. Will, I'd wish you luck, but I don't think you need it. You're doing just fine. But I wish you the best and be well. Thanks for taking the time.
Thanks so much, Joe. This is great. Appreciate it.
You're very welcome. And to find out more about Will and his company, check out @will.us. And that's it for this edition of the Forbes Books Podcast. If you enjoy the show, make sure you take a second to subscribe so you automatically get my new shows when they drop. Also, if you have a minute, I'd love if you left us a review so more amazing entrepreneurs like yourself can discover the show. And please, don't forget the golden rule and treat others as you want to be treated. Thanks for listening. Until next time, adios.
This has been a production of Forbes Books Radio. Find out more at ForbesBooksRadio.com.